For years, people expected the end to come with noise. They imagined shouting, accusations, a moment so explosive it would explain everything that followed. That's how reality television trains its audience to understand endings: loud, emotional, unmistakable. But that moment never came. No one screamed. And that absence mattered more than any argument ever could have. At some point, the raised voices stopped not because things improved, but because the energy to raise them disappeared. Anger requires belief. It requires the belief that being heard might still change something. That belief faded quietly, long before anyone noticed. When people stop screaming, it's not peace, it's exhaustion. This is how the ending actually began. Not with conflict, but with a shift so subtle it was almost invisible at first. Conversations became shorter, reactions became muted. Moments that once would have sparked tension passed without comment. Not because they didn't matter, because they no longer felt worth fighting over. The silence didn't arrive all at once. It settled gradually, like dust in a room no one was using anymore. Each unresolved issue added another layer. Each disappointment made speaking up feel less necessary. Eventually, silence became the default. What's important to understand is that silence doesn't mean nothing is happening. It means everything has already happened internally. Decisions are forming beneath the surface. Conclusions are being reached quietly, without debate. By the time people stop screaming, they're no longer trying to be understood. They're trying to protect themselves. There was a time when tension led to confrontation, when frustration demanded expression, when being upset still felt productive. That time passed slowly, replaced by something heavier: resignation. Resignation doesn't announce itself. It shows up in lowered expectations, in the way people stop asking questions they already know the answers to, in how hope gets smaller without ever fully disappearing, until one day it's gone. When no one screams, it's because screaming would require caring enough to risk disappointment again. This is the part many people miss. Silence isn't the absence of feeling, it's the presence of clarity. Clarity that nothing said will change the outcome. Clarity that effort has become one-sided. Clarity that distance feels easier than honesty. That clarity didn't arrive in a single moment. It was earned over time, through repetition. The same conversations, the same promises, the same frustrations cycling with resolution. Eventually, the cycle stopped, not because it was fixed, because it was abandoned, and abandonment doesn't make noise. Another reason the ending came quietly is because everyone involved already knew the truth in different ways. They didn't need confirmation. They didn't need a final argument to validate their feelings. They had lived the pattern long enough to recognize where it was going. Screaming would have implied uncertainty. There was none left. By the time the silence settled in, the most painful realizations had already happened privately. People had already mourned the future they once imagined. They had already adjusted to the idea that things wouldn't change. That mourning didn't look dramatic. It looked like withdrawal. Withdrawal from emotional investment, from explaining, from hoping. That's why the ending felt so confusing to outsiders. From the outside, things appeared calmer, more controlled, less chaotic. But calm without connection is not stability. It's distance. And distance doesn't erupt. It expands. Every quiet moment created more space. Every avoided conversation widened it. Every decision not to engage made it harder to come back. What replaced screaming wasn't peace, it was detachment. Detachment allows people to coexist without confronting what they've already accepted. It makes staying feel manageable even when connection is gone. For a while, that detachment can look like maturity, like growth, like everyone has finally learned to communicate better. But communication didn't improve. It disappeared. When communication disappears, endings are already underway. The real shift happened when silence stopped feeling tense, when it stopped demanding resolution, when it became comfortable. Comfortable silence is the most dangerous sign of all. It means people are no longer waiting for change. They've already adapted to its absence. This is why no one screamed at the end. There was nothing left to demand, nothing left to defend, nothing left to prove. The ending didn't arrive with a breaking point. It arrived with a settling point, the moment when everyone stopped pushing against what was already immovable. And once that happens, the outcome is no longer in question.
The next part will explore how this silence reshaped behavior long before the ending became obvious, and why the absence of screaming was actually the clearest signal that it was already over. After the screaming stopped, behavior began to change in ways that were easy to overlook. There was no announcement that things were different, no declaration that effort was being withdrawn. The shift happened quietly, through small choices that felt practical rather than emotional. People showed up, but they didn't lean in. They participated, but they stopped investing. That difference is subtle, but it's everything. Before, effort was visible. Even when it was messy, it was present. Disagreement still meant people cared enough to push back. Frustration still meant something was being fought for. When the screaming ended, what ended with it was the belief that fighting mattered. The first sign was how problems were handled. Issues that once would have sparked long discussions were met with short responses. Not dismissive, just final. Not, let's talk about this, but okay. That single word carried more meaning than any argument ever had. Okay meant acceptance. It meant the issue was no longer worth unpacking, that the emotional return on effort had dropped too low to justify engagement. Another shift happened in tone. Voices didn't rise anymore, but they didn't soften either. Conversation stayed neutral, controlled, almost careful. Nothing was said that might open a door to deeper discussion. Not because people were afraid of conflict, because they were done with it. Conflict implies there's still something to resolve. Silence implies resolution has already happened internally. Another behavior change showed up in timing. Responses slowed. Follow-ups became inconsistent. Not out of spite, but because urgency was gone. When something matters deeply, it creates urgency. When urgency disappears, it means importance has shifted. Another sign was how people handled disappointment. Before, disappointment might have turned into confrontation or emotional expression. Now it turned into adjustment. People stopped expecting things that had repeatedly let them down. They lowered their expectations without announcing it. They planned around reality instead of hoping it would change. That kind of adjustment doesn't come from optimism. It comes from clarity. Another noticeable change was how emotional labor was distributed. For a long time, certain people may have carried the weight of keeping things functional, smoothing over tension, initiating conversations, absorbing discomfort so others didn't have to. When the screaming stopped, so did that labor. Not dramatically, quietly. And when emotional labor disappears, the imbalance becomes obvious. Things don't fall apart immediately. They just stop being held together. Another shift happened in how people related to silence itself. Silence used to feel charged, like something was waiting to be said. Now it felt empty, neutral, even relieving. Relief is an important signal. It means something that once felt burdensome has been released. That relief didn't feel joyful, it felt calm. And calm in this context wasn't healing, it was detachment. Another behavior change was how people spoke about the future. Long-term language faded. Plans became conditional. We'll see replaced we should. When people stop speaking about the future with certainty, it's because they've stopped imagining it together. That shift doesn't require a conversation. It happens when the internal picture no longer makes sense. Another subtle sign was how people responded to each other's emotions. There was less curiosity, less follow-up. Feelings were acknowledged politely, but not explored. That politeness masked a deeper truth. Emotional responsibility had been withdrawn. People were no longer trying to fix each other's feelings. They were managing their own. Another reason this stage is often misunderstood is because it looks peaceful. There's less chaos, fewer blow-ups, more control. But control without connection is not stability. It's distance wearing the costume of calm. Another sign was how quickly people recovered from moments that once would have lingered. A disagreement might happen, but it didn't echo. It didn't reopen old wounds. It didn't lead to long conversations. It simply ended. That quick recovery wasn't growth. It was indifference. Indifference doesn't mean people don't care at all. It means they care less than they used to, and they know it. Another change showed up in decision-making. People stopped seeking consensus. They made choices independently and informed others afterward. That's a major shift. Consensus is for people who believe their lives are still intertwined emotionally. Independent decision-making signals emotional separation. Another reason the silence mattered so much is that it created space for internal honesty.
Without the noise of conflict, people could finally hear their own thoughts clearly. And what they heard wasn't encouraging. They heard fatigue. They heard resignation. They heard a quiet voice saying, "This isn't working, and it hasn't been for a long time." That voice didn't need to scream. It just needed to be acknowledged. By the time behavior changes in these ways, endings are no longer hypothetical. They're already in motion. The absence of screaming didn't mean the absence of pain. It meant pain had changed form. It had become informational rather than emotional. Instead of asking for attention, it was guiding choices. And once pain starts guiding choices, the path forward narrows. The next part will explore why this stage can last longer than anyone expects, and how people can remain physically present long after they've emotionally left, without even realizing they've crossed that line. After behavior began to change, something confusing happened. Nothing ended. At least, not in any way that looked final. Everyone was still there, the structure still existed, daily life continued to function. From the outside, it could easily look like things had stabilized. Fewer arguments, less chaos, more quiet. But what had actually happened was far more decisive. People had left emotionally, and emotional exits don't announce themselves. They linger. This is the stage where distance becomes normal, where physical presence continues, but emotional investment does not. People are still part of the system, but they're no longer trying to shape it. They coexist. Coexistence is often mistaken for healing. It isn't. It's what happens when people no longer believe engagement will lead to change. One reason this stage lasts is familiarity. Familiarity keeps people in place long after connection is gone.
not because they're confused, but because the known feels safer than the unknown. After the screaming stopped, the emotional risk disappeared too. Without risk, there was no pressure to act. Staying didn't hurt the way it once did. Distance dulled the pain. Another reason people remained physically present is because emotional closure had already happened privately. Closure doesn't require departure. It requires acceptance. That acceptance had already settled in. People had adjusted their expectations. They no longer waited for things to feel different. They stopped hoping for repair. They stopped being surprised by disappointment. Once expectations change, behavior follows quietly. Another subtle sign was how people participated. They showed up, but only as much as required. They didn't volunteer. They didn't initiate. They responded, but they didn't reach. That kind of presence looks cooperative, even polite, but it's hollow. It's the presence of someone who has already decided not to invest more than necessary. Another reason this stage is hard to recognize is that silence feels easier than conflict. For a while, everyone benefits from that ease. Less tension, less emotional drain, fewer confrontations. It can feel like progress, but progress requires direction. This quiet stage had none. It was simply a pause between endings. Another factor keeping people in place was responsibility. Even after emotional detachment, many people still feel responsible for minimizing harm, for not disrupting others, for not making things harder than they need to be. That sense of responsibility delays visible endings, not because people are unsure, because they're careful. Another sign of emotional exit was how people talked about time. Future references became vague. Nothing was planned for ahead. Everything felt provisional. When people stop anchoring themselves to a shared future, they're already preparing for separation. Another subtle shift was how people reacted to emotional moments. There was acknowledgement, but no engagement. Sympathy without involvement. Listening without leaning in. That's not cruelty. It's detachment. Detachment happens when people stop seeing themselves as part of the solution. Another reason this stage can last is that distance itself brings relief. Not happiness, relief. Relief from constant tension, relief from disappointment, relief from emotional labor. That relief makes staying tolerable. But tolerable is not sustainable. Eventually, the relief wears off, and what remains is emptiness. Another telling sign was how silence changed meaning. It was no longer uncomfortable. It no longer begged to be filled. It simply existed. Silence without discomfort means resolution has already happened. People weren't waiting for the next conversation. They weren't bracing for the next argument. They weren't hoping for clarity. They already had it. Another reason the stage persists is that emotional exits are invisible. They don't create scenes. They don't demand acknowledgement. They just quietly redirect energy elsewhere.
People begin investing in themselves, in peace, in stability, in parts of life that don't require constant negotiation. Those investments slowly pull them away from what they've already let go of internally. By the time anyone notices the distance, it feels sudden. But it isn't. It's the result of many small decisions made in silence. This is why no one screamed at the end. The screaming stopped long before the ending became visible. The next part will explore how this quiet distance eventually turns into undeniable separation, and why by the time that happens, there's nothing left to argue about. Eventually, the distance that had been quietly settling into place became impossible to ignore. Not because anyone made a dramatic move, because the structure could no longer carry the weight of emotional absence. This is the stage where what was once subtle becomes visible. Patterns repeat without variation. Conversations feel rehearsed. Interactions become functional rather than meaningful. People aren't reacting anymore, they're managing. And management is not connection. Another shift happens when effort stops being disguised. Earlier, imbalance could be hidden by goodwill or habit. Someone would fill the gaps, smooth things over, compensate. By this point, no one is compensating anymore. Not out of bitterness, out of clarity. When emotional labor is withdrawn, the system reveals itself exactly as it is, and what it reveals is often unsustainable. That's when separation starts to look inevitable. Not dramatic. Logical. Another reason the distance becomes undeniable is that alignment disappears. People stop moving in the same direction. Decisions no longer consider the whole, only the individual. Schedules diverge. Priorities shift. Availability becomes selective. Not aggressively. Intentionally. Another noticeable change is how people talk about the situation when asked. There's no defensiveness, no emotional charge, just explanation. Explanation without emotion is a sign that something has already ended internally. Unresolved situations create intensity. Resolved ones create simplicity.
Another reason separation becomes visible is that people stop imagining repair. The idea doesn't feel hopeful anymore. It feels exhausting. When the thought of fixing something feels heavier than the thought of letting it go, the ending has already chosen its shape. Another shift happens in how people remember the past. It's no longer idealized. The good is acknowledged, but so is the cost. Memory becomes balanced instead of selective. That balance removes nostalgia's pull. Another reason this stage feels quiet is that grief has already been processed. The sadness happened earlier, during realization, during resignation, during the moment screaming stopped. What remains now is steadiness. Not happiness. Steadiness. Steadiness allows people to move forward without second guessing. Another sign separation is near is relief becoming consistent. Relief from tension, relief from waiting, relief from emotional uncertainty. Relief doesn't push people back. It carries them forward. Another subtle but powerful change is how people talk about themselves. Language shifts from we to I without announcement. That shift alone signals the end of shared identity. Another reason the distance becomes undeniable is that people stop fearing the consequences of separation, not because the consequences disappear, but because staying feels heavier than leaving. Fear loses its power when clarity outweighs it. Another important detail is that nothing new needs to happen to justify the ending. There's no final straw, no tipping point. The accumulation is enough. And accumulation doesn't scream. It settles. This is the moment where outsiders might finally notice and say, something's changed. They're right. But the change didn't just happen. It finished happening. The silence that once felt temporary has become permanent. The distance that once felt manageable now defines the relationship. By this point, separation isn't a question of if, it's a matter of when and how quietly. The next part will explore why this kind of ending doesn't seek confrontation or explanation, and why silence becomes the most honest conclusion when screaming has lost its meaning. By the time this stage arrives, there is nothing left to explain. That's the part most people struggle to understand. They expect a final conversation, a moment where everything is laid out clearly, where reasons are given, where responsibility is assigned. They imagine closure as something spoken. But this ending doesn't need words, because words would only repeat what everyone already knows. Silence becomes the conclusion not because people are avoiding truth, but because the truth has already been accepted. There is no confusion left to resolve, no misunderstanding to clear up.
No outcome that conversation could realistically change. When no one screamed, it wasn't because emotions were weak, it was because certainty was strong. At this point, people aren't leaving angrily, they're leaving honestly. Or, just as often, they're staying physically while leaving emotionally until circumstances make the physical separation inevitable. Distance doesn't demand agreement. It doesn't ask for permission. It doesn't require validation from the other side. It simply happens. Another reason there is no final confrontation is that confrontation implies negotiation. It implies that something is still open to change, but nothing is. The ending has already been lived internally. The grief has already been felt. The hope has already been released. The future has already been reimagined with the old structure. What's left is alignment, behavior finally matching reality. This kind of ending protects dignity. No one has to be declared the villain. No one has to be proven right or wrong. No one has to justify why they're done. Distance allows everyone to step away without turning the ending into a performance, and that matters. Another quiet truth is that distance feels safer than one last fight. A final fight would reopen wounds that have already closed. It would force people to revisit pain they've already processed. Distance avoids that. It lets the ending remain calm, even if it's sad. Another sign that this is the real ending is how people remember it afterward. There's no obsession with what could have been said differently, no replaying of final moments. There's acceptance. Acceptance doesn't need to defend itself. Another reason silence becomes permanent is that people have reclaimed themselves. They've reconnected with parts of their identity that were lost in the struggle to keep things together. They found steadiness elsewhere.
Once that steadiness exists, returning to emotional chaos feels unnecessary. Distance doesn't feel cold anymore. It feels appropriate. This is why the ending didn't come with screaming. Screaming is what happens when people still believe something can be saved. Silence is what happens when they know it can't. Sister Wives didn't end in a fight because fights are for moments of resistance. It ended in distance because distance is what remains when resistance is gone. And that kind of ending doesn't announce itself. It settles in quietly, stays put, and eventually becomes the only truth left standing. No one screamed, because by then, there was nothing left to say. What makes this kind of ending linger is that it doesn't feel like an ending when it happens. There's no clear moment to point to, no sound that marks the conclusion, no scene that signals this is where it stopped. Instead, it feels like life simply keeps moving, just slightly altered. People go on, days continue, routines remain. And only later does the realization settle in that something essential is no longer there. That's the strange power of distance. It doesn't announce loss, it reveals it slowly. Long after the screaming stops, long after the arguments fade, people begin to notice the absence of emotional pull, the absence of urgency, the absence of need. That's when they understand. This didn't end suddenly. It ended quietly, over time. Another truth about endings like this is that they don't feel dramatic to the people inside them. They feel inevitable, natural, like the final step of a process that has been unfolding for years. By the time the distance is complete, there's often relief mixed with sadness. Relief that the tension is gone, relief that the effort is no longer required, relief that honesty no longer has to be postponed. Sadness still exists, but it's softer now. It doesn't demand attention, it doesn't control decisions. It simply acknowledges what was. Another reason this ending feels final is that no one is waiting anymore. No one is waiting for apologies, no one is waiting for change, no one is waiting for the other side to finally understand. Waiting is what keeps relationships alive when they're struggling. When waiting ends, so does the relationship. Distance is not passive. It's active acceptance. It's choosing not to reopen something that has already closed emotionally. And once that choice is made, there's no pullback. What remains is memory. Not longing, not regret, just memory. The ability to look back without needing to return. That's how you know it's truly over. Not when people stop talking, not when they stop fighting, but when they stop hoping. This is why no one screamed, because screaming belongs to moments of resistance. This ending belonged to acceptance. Sister Wives didn't end with noise because noise would have meant someone still believed the story could continue. It ended in distance because distance is what's left when belief is gone. And distance, once settled, doesn't reverse itself.
It becomes the quiet truth everyone lives with, even if no one ever says it out loud. That's how it really ended.